Welcome to the debate. When we think of totalitarian regimes, we tend to imagine these, perfectly oiled machines.
Right, like a dictator pulls a lever at the top and the gears turn exactly as commanded down at the bottom.
Exactly. But what if you actually open the vault, look at the surviving wartime paper trail of the Third Reich, and just find a chaotic, decentralized mess?
It's a deeply uncomfortable historical controversy, really. And today we're diving into exactly that, based on the source material in David Irving's Hitler's War.
Yeah, we're looking at Adolf Hitler's direct role, his actual knowledge, and his strategic intent during World War II, specifically regarding the overarching atrocities and his real foreign policy goals.
Right. And the central conflict we really have to unpack here is this. Does a strict reliance on surviving primary documents reveal a weak dictator isolated from his subordinates' actions?
Or does the lack of a single, smoking gun written order just obscure the reality of how his explicit ideological rhetoric drove the systematic actions of the state?
Exactly.
So I'll be taking what historians often call a structuralist approach, meaning I'm looking at how the sprawling, decentralized bureaucracy of the Nazi state actually functioned in practice. I'll argue that he lacked direct oversight over many of the atrocities committed in his name.
And I approach this from the intentionalist perspective. I'll be arguing that his absolute ideological authority and his constant public mandates make the lack of a specific written order, completely irrelevant.
To start, when you adhere strictly to primary wartime documents, a very counterintuitive picture emerges. You see that dictatorships can actually be fundamentally weak during a war.
Weak in what sense, though?
Logistically, he was simply unable to oversee all functions of his far-flung empire. Germany functioned almost as a state without its leader heavily involved in domestic policy.
Because that was delegated, right?
Yeah, it was controlled by powerful lieutenants like Goering, Himmler, and Goebbels. When you look for a central order for the extermination of the Jews, it just isn't there. Instead, the documents suggest a conscious desire to remain detached.
But treating the absence of a specific document as proof of ignorance is, I think it's a profound analytical failure. He wasn't just an executive dodging paperwork.
Well, he was heavily insulated.
Insulated, sure, but he was the sole architect of the ideological atmosphere. Look at his creation of the SS with Himmler. Look at his explicit public rhetoric, which his inner circle openly acknowledged as literal instruction.
Right, but
he commanded the overarching destruction by establishing the mandate, even if he carefully avoided putting his signature on a specific operational decree.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Let's look exactly at what happens when historians go into the vault and look for that piece of paper. Take Himmler's handwritten note from November 30th, 1941.
Okay.
This is primary evidence logging a phone conversation made directly from Hitler's bunker. The note explicitly reads, quote, "Transport of Jews from Berlin, no liquidation." Now, if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, well, of course he ordered the overarching policy. He's the dictator. But strict adherence to original documents forces us to ask a tough question.
Which is?
How can we assume a blanket extermination order existed when the hard, surviving paper trail actually shows him intervening to halt a specific liquidation?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
You were taking an isolated, no liquidation order for one specific transport and using it to negate the entire systemic mandate he spent years building. You have to contextualize these documents with how the regime actually operated.
But the documents are the physical proof of the operation.
Sure, but go back to January 1939. He made a very public prophecy that a world war would result in the destruction of the Jews. Goebbels recorded in his own diary that this was not just an empty phrase.
Right. His rhetoric was violent, yes.
But his inner circle knew his rhetoric wasn't just talk. It was a directive. He didn't need to sign a piece of paper for every transport because he had already calibrated the system to operate on a frequency of annihilation.
But let's talk about the mechanics of how that system actually operated, because it wasn't a clean flow chart. Think of it more like a toxic corporate structure.
A toxic corporate structure?
Yeah, like the CEO sets an impossibly extreme goal, refuses to leave a paper trail, and then lets rival department heads, his fanatical lieutenants, ruthlessly compete to achieve it.
Okay, I see the analogy.
This is how the bureaucracy functioned. During the war, he was locked away behind barbed wire at his remote military headquarters, entirely absorbed in military strategy in Russia and the West. He left the domestic implementation to those autonomous lieutenants.
Who were constantly trying to guess what he wanted, right?
Exactly. They were acting on their own lethal momentum.
That's an interesting way to frame it. But if a CEO intentionally structures a company to be ruthless and illegal, by deliberately empowering fanatics and setting that extreme culture, they remain fully culpable for the outcome.
Culpable morally, yes, but mechanically?
Even mechanically. The idea that he was totally detached from the details just isn't supported by the source material. He wasn't passively sitting in the wolf's lair.
He was focused on the military map, though.
But to maintain absolute authority, he consumed a phenomenal amount of information. Ambassador Huell logged over 1,100 diplomatic papers passing directly through his hands. He was managing an immense flow of data. He demanded the details.
But even if he was micromanaging that flow of data, look at what those documents actually say about his strategic goals. The assumption is usually that he wanted total world domination, right?
Well, yeah, that's the general historical consensus.
But the foreign policy records show a remarkably limited war aim. Specifically, the primary documents reveal he didn't actually want to destroy the British Empire.
Wait, seriously? That completely contradicts the Blitz and his constant military aggression in the West. Are you saying he actually wanted to preserve the British position?
That's exactly what the paper trail indicates. In June 1940, there's an explicit order from him forbidding Admiral Canaris from introducing bacterial warfare against Britain.
Huh.
Beyond that, he repeatedly asserted in private that the downfall of the British Empire would be to the detriment of the white race. The documents show a leader remarkably willing to show restraint, hoping to leave Britain's global position intact and come to diplomatic terms with them.
See, I read that entirely differently. That supposed restraint wasn't a genuine ideological limitation. It was cynical, strategic opportunism.
Opportunism to what end?
He temporarily spared Britain to focus his ambitions on Russia. Look at his own private admissions about how he viewed diplomacy. He explicitly told Ribbentrop that he had to resort to fraud on a grand scale when it came to international agreements.
Yes, he lied in diplomacy, but
But it goes deeper. When he addressed his regional party bosses, the Gauleiters, he stated that in history, the victor is always right. He declared his readiness to act ice cool and violate every recognized law of state.
right. His ultimate strategic ruthlessness overrode any temporary diplomatic overtures.
Well, when you look at all of this together, while the moral catastrophe of the regime is undeniable, I just can't get past the fact that the actual surviving documents show a highly fragmented system.
Fragmented, sure, but still unified in purpose.
But if we want to understand the actual mechanics of history, we have to rely on hard, primary evidence, rather than assuming total, omnipotent control by a single figure. The records reveal a chaotic command structure, where lieutenants possessed incredible operational autonomy. And for me, taking a dictator's carefully curated paper trail, or specifically, the deliberate lack thereof, at face value ignores the brutal reality of totalitarian power.
You think it gives them too much credit?
I think a leader who builds an apparatus of terror, creates its ideological justification, and publicly mandates its goals cannot be separated from its ultimate actions simply because he didn't sign the final receipt.
I think we can both agree, at least, that the source material exposes the terrifying complexity of how the Third Reich actually operated. It proves it wasn't a simple, well-oiled machine.
Oh, definitely. It was a dark, convoluted system of competing power structures.
Absolutely.
And rigorous debate challenges accepted historical narratives and forces us to look closer at the mechanics of power. The complexities of wartime dictatorships are profound, and there is so much more to explore in the source material than simple caricatures of a monolithic state.
Which brings us back to that idea of the totalitarian machine. Sometimes the most terrifying realization isn't that one man stood at a control panel pulling every single lever,
Right.
but that he was able to build a system so devastating it didn't even need his hands on the controls to keep destroying.